So there's just so many different ways you could think about this. You know, was she really that in love with Elvis during their time together in Germany and afterward? Or was she just caught up with the idea of the fame of it all, the excitement of it all? And was it just her natural, fierce, competitive side coming out, wanting to hold on to him, seeing him as that prize that she could wrestle away from other women like Anita would? And at this point, the author's asserting that because she was so saucy by the author's accounts, that at this point, Priscilla took matters into her own hands, and Elvis wasn't the only person in Priscilla's life. But it gets better, you guys. CURRIE's veracity on this point did not prove conclusively that Priscilla was lying or in denial about all of their points of disagreement, but it went a long way toward establishing his legitimacy and her desperation. Riddle me this, Priscilla. How can you carry on like this? Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Jennifer. I'm so happy to have you back. Can you believe we are on episode 14 of Child Bride, the untold story of Priscilla Presley by Suzanne Finstad. Now this chapter we're going to recap today, chapter 14, is called Sex and Rock and Roll. Now this chapter begins where we left off in chapter 13, and that was Priscilla telling us that she was still unsure about her place in Elvis's life. She knew she cared for him. She had spent 5 months with him in Germany, and she knew that when he would go back to the States, that she wasn't going to see him again. And she knew that this was a very uncertain time for her. She had no idea if Elvis was going to continue a relationship with her, albeit a long distance one, once he returned back to the States. She knew that he was going to reassume his career. He was going to go back to filming movies, probably be around a bunch of beautiful women, available women at his disposal. So she was super anxious. She was super unsure about her place and position in Elvis's life. And she basically characterized it in interviews with Suzanne, the author, saying, you know, I just kind of was taking it for what it was, and I was just going to take advantage of the time that I had with him, and beyond that, there was nothing I could do. And this chapter starts by saying, well, you know, it wasn't quite that way. Priscilla wasn't the super docile, quiet, demure girl that she tried to appear to be. And it's interesting because Suzanne starts this chapter by saying that her claim that she was just leaving her future with Elvis in the hands of fate isn't entirely true. She was basically relaying to the author that, you know, she already knew about the troubles that Elvis was experiencing in his relationship with Anita Wood. Now, we talked about Anita Wood in the last episode. If you haven't watched that one yet, please go check it out. Heck, if you're not even that deep into the playlist yet, and this is maybe the first or second episode that you've ever watched of my Child Bride series, go back. There are so many great stories up to this point to get Priscilla where she is now in Germany, in the throes of a romantic relationship with Elvis Presley. Her, a 14-year-old ninth grade schoolgirl, him, a 24-year-old international sex symbol superstar. Okay, so by this point, she knows about Anita Wood, who is his sweet and petite, soft-spoken local celebrity Memphian girlfriend that he had been with for, at that point, about 3 years. And he continued with Anita pretty much up until the point that Priscilla moved into Graceland when she was 17 years old. And he was torn between Anita and Priscilla by separate accounts, and also by Anita's interviews that she's given over the years. So while she was in Germany, Priscilla knew about Anita. She knew because she was reading Anita's letters to Elvis that Elvis had in his bedroom. Priscilla tells the author of Child Bride that she would just basically pore over these letters. She would glean any type of information she could, basically sizing up her competition, sizing up Anita. And in doing so, she was really trying to formulate in her mind a battle plan, so to speak. Basically a way that she could mold herself into Elvis's ideal woman. And Elvis had also been talking to Priscilla about Anita, saying that he wasn't quite sure if she had been faithful to him. He wasn't sure about her. He had all these conflicting emotions regarding Anita and going back to Anita. And he's confiding this to Priscilla. So Priscilla's taking what Elvis is telling her. She's taking what she's reading from Anita's letters to Elvis. She's taking what she can from Anita, looking at the these letters that Anita is writing to Elvis. And in that sense, what she's doing, like I said, is formulating her battle plan. And the author says, Priscilla began making mental notes from Anita's letters and Elvis's responses, silently assessing and categorizing what he liked and what he disliked in women, so as to eliminate Anita from what she saw as a competition for Elvis's affection. And if you're wondering, I'm not reading from the book, I'm reading from my Kindle here. It's just easier when I film. And Priscilla's telling the author that she's poring over these letters. She's internalizing every single thing that she's reading. And we all know about Priscilla's attempts to transform herself into Elvis's ideal woman. In previous episodes, we talked about how when she went to go see Elvis's first movie, that came out in 1956 called Love Me Tender, she had read in movie magazines at the time that Elvis was just besotted with his co-star Deborah Paget. We talked about her in episode 5. And Deborah Paget was just this beautiful, religious, innocent virgin that he had met, and they had forged a pretty deep bond together while filming the movie. And according to Deborah Paget, she told the author that Elvis was so in love with Deborah that after they had wrapped up filming and he was on the road, that he had called her from the road asking Deborah to marry him. Now, at that time, it wasn't meant to be. Deborah was a very sheltered young woman, and Deborah's parents, particularly her mother, were very, very strict, and they didn't want Deborah to have anything to do with a hip shaking rock and roll star. They were like, heck no to that. So it wasn't meant to be. So Priscilla knows all this. She's reading in the magazines that Elvis is completely in love with Deborah. And in those interviews that Elvis was giving to those movie magazines at the time of filming Love Me Tender, he was telling these reporters that he thought that Deborah was the most beautiful, wonderful woman he had ever laid eyes on. So Priscilla read all this. So what does Priscilla do? At the time, what she did was she copied Deborah Paget's hairstyle. Deborah Paget's hairstyle was a very distinct hairdo. And if you're interested, I encourage you to go Google 1956 Love Me Tender Deborah Paget. You'll see the hairstyle where it's short and curly about the face, and you have this long tendril ponytail that you wear to the side, and that's exactly the hairstyle that Priscilla copied. We also talked about in past episodes, that's exactly what struck Elvis when he first saw Priscilla, that he had confided to members of his crew, his friends, basically like, he was blown away when he saw Priscilla. And by all accounts, he's the one that had that thunderbolt attraction feeling to Priscilla. Priscilla herself, she even tells the author that she was a little bit more calm, a little bit more reserved. She felt a pull toward him, but it definitely wasn't that instant fall in love moment that so many suspected that Elvis felt when he first met Priscilla. So the author's saying not only is she getting all this information from Anita's letters, studying Elvis, his likes, his dislikes, trying to transform herself into his ideal woman, right down to the Deborah Paget hairstyle. And, she's telling the author that this actually was quite easy for her to do. And Priscilla says, quote, "You have to remember," she revealed years later to the author, "it wasn't difficult to behave like that because I felt I already was like that. So I had a head start. I knew that he loved feminine girls. I knew that he loved small girls. I knew his thoughts. I knew what he liked. I knew what he was attracted to. So what was I going to do? Become whatever it was." And you know what? I was thinking about this. Priscilla's reserve and kind of her determination, her icy determination, her fierce competitiveness, her ability to keep secrets, it's very uncharacteristic for a young 14-year-old teenage girl of the time. This is my opinion. And the reason why I think that is because it was so much easier to remain innocent for a lot longer back then. It's not the way it is now, where everything is so much more sexually explicit everywhere you turn. Movies, television, music, social media, everything is in your face, and everything just serves to rob these young kids today of their innocence so much more quickly, and people just grow up quicker. So most 14-year-olds in Priscilla's day were all about ice cream sundaes, bubblegum, and hoop skirts and bobby socks. It wasn't the way it is today, where everyone is growing up and maturing so much faster. But as we've seen, like in earlier episodes, Priscilla was taught to keep secrets. She was taught to keep her cards close to her vest. The identity of her real father was kept from her stepfather, Paul Beaulieu, and her mother, Anne Beaulieu. And she felt very, very betrayed when she found out. And we've talked about that in previous episodes. Her friends at the time at Del Valley Junior High in Texas said that they noticed a marked difference in her personality around the time that Priscilla tells us that she found out that Paul Beaulieu wasn't her real father. So of course you grow up that way. You keep secrets, and as her mother asked her to keep that secret to protect her stepfather's fragile ego. I mean, imagine putting that emotional burden on a child. So when that burden is placed on you, you are forced to grow up and mature a lot faster. And also her friends at the time talked about how she got more quiet, she got more reserved, she started running with a tougher, faster, older crowd. We don't know what to make of this. So in my opinion, this overly secretive environment that Priscilla grew up in within her own family, no wonder she's behaving like that in other areas of her life, in all of her relationships. It's carried out to where she is now in her 80s. And also you have to remember, mainstream America back then, 40s, 50s, 60s, I mean, mainstream America was unbelievably wholesome. So if you were growing up faster, if you were maturing faster the way that Priscilla was, one of only two things could have been happening, or both. You're either exposed to situations that force you to grow up and mature a lot faster, or you go out looking for it. In Priscilla's case, I think that both of those boxes were ticked, but I talked about how meticulous the author is in her research. And again, she is crazy meticulous. She's quoting from classmates of Priscilla's at the time in Germany when she's dating Elvis, and they're all characterizing her as being someone that is secretive, aloof, much more physically mature looking and acting for her age. And given the fact that she was a 14-year-old schoolgirl dating an international superstar, Elvis Presley, who was 24 at the time. I mean, if that's not going to cause you to mature a whole heck of a lot faster, I don't know what will. And she even tells the author that in her time with Elvis, those 5 months when they were together in Germany, the whole secretive side of her personality just was really, really more prominent and came out more and more and more, because all the whisperings, all the rumblings between people that knew about it at the school, people that knew about it in the military community and the military families that they lived in proximity to on the base, they were all kind of looking at this whole situation and frowning upon it. And for example, the author is quoting Karen Grant, who is Currie Grant's daughter, and Karen saying that her mother, Carol Grant, Currie's wife, was saying that she always thought of Priscilla as being prissy and assertive and aloof, and the type of girl, quote, that you think she's innocent, but she's really not. There's another classmate that the author quotes is Mary Ann Barks, and Mary Ann told Suzanne, the author, that, quote, any girl who dated a GI was considered trash. We talked about that in, I believe, chapter 9. And she also talked to another classmate of Priscilla's by the name of Debbie Ross, and I'm reading from my notes here. And Debbie says, when talking about any high school girl dating a GI at the time, she says, quote, that was not considered proper to do that. That kind of mixing was not approved of, in the military community at that time. And if you'll remember from previous episodes, Debbie Ross was the one who apparently lived in the same building as Priscilla, her family. And Debbie says that her mother didn't even want her hanging around with Priscilla because she thought that was a really bad element for Debbie to be hanging around with, because she was dating someone that was that much older, and also because her parents seemingly seemed to approve of it and didn't bat an eyelash at the whole thing. So there's all these whisperings going on about Priscilla, about her reputation both at school and on the military base with all these families. And the author tells us at this point in the book that Priscilla is getting obviously closer and closer to Elvis. They're spending a lot of time alone, particularly in his bedroom, a lot of time talking, a lot of time listening to the radio. He's pouring out his heart to her. She's, reading these letters. She's just basically absorbing everything like a sponge. She talks about a lot of making out, a lot of heavy petting. And it's at this point that Priscilla tells the author that Elvis is revealing to Priscilla more and more and more about his insecurities in the bedroom, about his performance anxiety in bedroom activities, basically saying that, yes, he is this international sex symbol. He's this man that every woman in the world desires, but yet he feels this unbearable anxiety and feeling that he cannot satisfy a woman because the expectations are just much too high for him. And he really feels crushed by that insecurity. And it says, Elvis Presley, the consummate performer, was so motivated to please, to gratify an audience of any size, that the expectation to deliver sexually was incapacitating to him. And he mentioned that to me even in Germany, Priscilla revealed. And then Joe Esposito, in his interviews with the author, he also says that he felt that Elvis was also very insecure in that way as well. And Joe says Elvis knew very little about sex. He wasn't raised on it. He wouldn't talk to people about it because he figured he knew everything. And his ego just wouldn't let him talk about it. And he said, Elvis never really talked at length about any type of romances or dates that he had gone on with girls, that he would basically say stuff like, oh, that woman was great last night, but he would never ever go into detail. So even Joe, one of his best personal friends that he met into the Army and someone who was in his life up to the very end, said that he always felt that Elvis was very insecure where sex and women were concerned. And it's at this point in the book that this is where she feels that Elvis developed his fascination and preference for young girls, 14, 15, 16 years old, because he was drawn to them, because that was his level of romantic development. And they were innocents, they were just starting out in their romantic journeys and their experiences. And that's where he felt the most comfortable, because they wouldn't put their expectations on him. They wouldn't question him. It was this symbiotic relationship where he felt safe. And there's a woman by the name of Willie J. Nichols, and she was a close friend of Gladys Presley, Elvis's mother, and she recounts many incidences at the Audubon Drive house. And this is the house that Elvis lived in Memphis prior to moving to Graceland with his parents. And she says that she remembers numerous sleepovers with 14, 15-year-old girls over at Elvis's house, basically saying that it was kind of like a big pajama party with these young girls and Elvis, and they would just stay up all night talking and just having fun, and everything was chaperoned, and Gladys was there. And she was even saying they were all close little friends. They talked, they discussed things. Gladys was okay with that. Elvis was just comfortable with these younger girls because he was so desperately insecure. And the author says, Elvis at heart was a shy, uneducated Southern mama's boy, despite his fame and reputation for carnal knowledge. So he was basically sheltered his entire life. He was a real mama's boy. And the author quotes another early friend of Elvis by the name of Alan Fortas. He was kind of like a very early member of the Memphis Mafia back before the days when Elvis really exploded. And he just says, remember, Elvis's childhood was sheltered by his mother. He wasn't around a lot of guys, so that's what it was more than anything. He was just super, super shy. I understand the strong bond and just the love between Elvis and Gladys. Elvis was a twin. His brother, Jesse Guerin, was stillborn. So that really explains why she was so fiercely protective of Elvis. But when I read things like this, I really think that it was to his detriment in a lot of ways, because I think that her strong need to protect and shelter him consumed her to the point where she couldn't step back and take a look at Elvis and his development, especially from his teens on. I don't know if she really had a capacity to look at that and say, like, we have to get this kid to branch out a little bit. We have to build up his confidence a little bit more. It just really seemed like she was so frightened of losing him the way that she lost his twin brother, that she would just do everything she could to shelter him and to nurture and baby him to the point where he was almost incapacitated in the way that he dealt with the world and relationships. There's no doubt that they loved each other, but that's just what I'm observing, reading all of this, all the books that I've read about their relationship over the years, the documentaries I've seen. It just really seemed like they were two super, super lonely people that clung to one another and did so desperately that it stunted, I believe, both of their emotions and any type of emotional growth that they would experience. So that's just my thought on that. But moving on, so the author talks about how, okay, the relationship between CURRIE Grant and Priscilla, what was that relationship all about? Did CURRIE really use Priscilla in that way in order to get what he wanted from her before he took her to meet Elvis? Priscilla hotly contests that. CURRIE maintains that Elvis admitted to him that him and Priscilla were fully intimate before he left Germany. But at this point in the book, I guess in an effort to be fair, the author is saying, now that we know about all of Elvis's insecurities in the bedroom, we know about how sheltered he was, we know he's confiding all of this to Priscilla. Priscilla's telling us that he's confiding all of this to her. So the author says, in a certain way, it begged the question whether Elvis and Priscilla had intercourse in Germany, as Currie claims Priscilla told him. Or, is it the $64,000 question? Was Priscilla indeed an innocent on their wedding night? Did he wait? And, I would be more apt to say, given all of the evidence that we've heard thus far, given the fact that Priscilla's story seems to change and turn over and over and over, I'm more apt to believe Currie Grant's accounts of his relationship and what Priscilla did indeed do to get to the point where Currie took her to meet Elvis. My opinion, the author's opinion, because again, we've established Priscilla has really, really tried to pound home over the decades that she wasn't an Elvis fan. And then again, remember, it also behooves her and her narrative about being an innocent on her wedding night if she can say, as she did in her first memoir, Elvis and Me, that toward the end of the time that she had with Elvis in Germany, that she was basically begging him to consummate their relationship, and he was refusing, saying, no, there will be a time for that, but not now, you're too young. And she uses these claims to perpetuate her story about being an innocent when she married him. You know what else, too? It's like, I just don't understand. This whole situation is so sad. It's just so tragic on its face when you think about it, just given the fact that she was so very young and vulnerable at this time. And she was apparently, and her parents were apparently so enthralled and so enamored with the fact that Elvis was just so famous. I mean, he was the most famous person in the world at that time, practically. But there was no one around her to stop any of this, to just put a halt to all of it and just say, like, is this healthy? Is this healthy for a 9th grade schoolgirl to go through emotionally, physically, all of it? But then I was thinking about Priscilla's mom's history, Anne, and she, at 16, snuck out of her parents' home to go date Priscilla's father, a naval pilot at the time. Coming from that background, I'm sure that there was a part of Anne that did sympathize with Priscilla and did want to live vicariously through Priscilla. Apparently, Priscilla's father, James Wagner, was the love of Anne's life. She was devastated when he died in a plane crash when Priscilla was only 6 months old. So obviously, I'm sure what's happening is she's watching this, she's observing everything that's going on, and she's reliving her own love story that she had with Priscilla's father. So there's so many conflicting narratives. I do feel that the mountain of evidence is slightly higher in Currie Grant's corner, and also with the thoughts that she's a lot more experienced than she's letting on. Who knows if her and Elvis were 100% intimate before they left Germany. There's people that are contending that. She's always held that they weren't. We also have evidence that Elvis was indeed deeply insecure and living up to that image in his intimate relationships. There's just a lot going on here, but I did mention this in the last episode when I read Lisa Marie's autobiography that her daughter Riley Keough finished for her, called Into the Great Unknown. Lisa does say that Priscilla admitted to Lisa that her and Elvis had been intimate when she was 18 years old. That's when Priscilla told Lisa that she lost her virginity. But in all of Priscilla's memoirs and interviews over the years, she maintains that it happened when she was 21 when they got married. Now, why has this been such a huge deal for so many episodes? And I'm sure you're asking yourself, like, why is this such a big deal for Priscilla? Because it is. Because I really think, when you think about it, Priscilla spent 18 years of her life with Elvis. She met him when she was 14, okay? She spent 18 years with him. He died in 1977, almost 50 years ago now, okay? She's lived most of her life with Elvis dead than with him alive. Most of the time in her life has been away from Elvis, but yet Priscilla has made Elvis's name, likeness, legend, her name, her likeness, her legend, and she has to preserve that. So that's why I think that this is such a source of contention for her. She has to die on this hill that she was innocent when she met him and remained so until they were married. She has to maintain the narrative that she came from a strict family and a strict upbringing so that her family looks better? What type of family would push their 14-year-old daughter into a relationship with someone much older? Begs the question. But in her memoirs, and particularly in Elvis and Me, she relays to the reader just how fascinated she was with Elvis, how blindly in love she was with him. And especially after he left Germany, she talks about how she was despondent, how she would refuse to eat. She had no interest in anything. She lived and breathed and thought of Elvis 24/7, and it got really bad after he left the country. And she talks about in her book, and also in her 1988 television miniseries, Elvis and Me, it's all dramatized in there about how worried her parents were and how they were just basically throwing their hands up in the air. We don't know what to do with this girl. She's obsessed with Elvis. She is so depressed and we can't help her. And that's the story that she uses to fuel the fact that, her parents really had no choice but to allow her to move to Graceland at 17, finish out high school in Memphis, and be with Elvis. And it's at this point in the chapter that the author tells us that, okay, then if she was so blindly in love with and loyal to Elvis while Elvis was there, and after Elvis left Germany, then why was Priscilla seen in the company of a young, tough boy, that was like a running with the rough crowd type of boy by the name of Tom Stewart? And there are several classmates that the author interviews that can attest to this relationship that Priscilla had with Tom. So there's just so many different ways you could think about this. Was she really that in love with Elvis during their time together in Germany and afterward? Or was she just caught up with the idea of the fame of it all, the excitement of it all? And was it just her natural, fierce, competitive side coming out, wanting to hold on to him, seeing him as that prize that she could wrestle away from other women like Anita would? And if Priscilla was indeed as saucy as the author contends with all these interviews that she conducted, I'm sure that Elvis's bedroom confessions to Priscilla about his insecurities probably went over like a lead balloon. Now, again, we have to, put our critical thinking hats on here. And yes, he may have confided that to her, and Priscilla tells us as such that he did. And as we've seen, there are people that were close to him that also echoed this, that talked about his insecurities with being a sex symbol, all of that. But the author says Priscilla was beginning to perceive that Elvis Presley, the person, was not what she had imagined if in her childhood fantasies back in Austin. He was a human being, a sex symbol with painful insecurities, a star of fragile complexity, not the demigod that she had envisioned. And at this point, the author's asserting that because she was so saucy by the author's accounts, and because she was so much more secretive, mature, and fast-paced than a lot of girls her age, that at this point, Priscilla took matters into her own hands, and Elvis wasn't the only person in Priscilla's life. There was a boy that the author now introduces to us by the name of Tom Stewart that apparently Priscilla was spending quite a bit of time with, although the timelines are a little bit sketchy as to when she started taking up with this boy. Was it while Elvis was still in Germany, or was it after Elvis had left? But she does conduct quite a few interviews with different classmates of Priscilla, and they all attest to, yes, she was seen in the company of Tom Stewart, and he was a fellow student. He was a sophomore at H.H. Arnold High School on the military base. So it's this somewhat physical tug of war between Elvis and Priscilla. If it is true that he's deeply insecure, that he's not engaging in as much activity as Priscilla wants or is needing from a companion, then that would explain why we're segueing into the identity of this guy, this Tom Stewart. And she's interviewing former classmates of him, and one is called Tom Muldoon, and he ran around with Tommy in Wiesbaden, and he said that Tommy smoked, he drank, he was a damn good athlete. He was kind of like a dangerous guy, Golden Glove champion. He used to get into fights, and that he wasn't a big guy, but that he was a tough guy, the type of guy that you just kind of left alone to his own devices because he was kind of a little bit of a live wire. There's another classmate, Steve Fox, who told the author that sociologically on the fringe, meaning Tom Stewart, he wasn't in the mainstream and he certainly had the intimidation factor. People were careful around him because he was somewhat of an enigma. And apparently Tom Stewart ran around with a boy gang and they were called the Spartans. And Suzanne interviewed a man by the name of Joe Delahunt, who was also a member of the Spartans gang. And he said that he placed Tommy in what he called a sexually progressive category. And he said that there was actually a street in Wiesbaden that Tommy would frequent when he wanted to get lucky, okay? And it's all very telling because we know that Priscilla is a keeper of secrets. We know that she's extremely beautiful and more mature than a lot of girls her age at the time. So it would stand to reason that, if she feels that she's not getting what she needs from Elvis in the way of intimate attention, that's why she's gravitating toward this kid, Tom Stewart. And the author's saying that this is indeed opposites track. She still had that icy, cold, kind of prim, prissy, innocent demure on the outside, which Tom really wasn't, but they just found each other. That's really appealing to the dark, dangerous side of Priscilla. And that dark, dangerous side, like we talked about in episodes 7 and 8, was manifesting and coming out even before Priscilla left for Germany. And we talked about another classmate of Priscilla's in the last episode by the name of Al CURRIE, who knew Priscilla after Elvis had left Germany. So this is then, I guess, attesting to the fact that if the relationship with Priscilla and Tom started before Elvis, maybe, but it definitely carried on after Elvis left, because this is Al's quote to the author. And he says, "I'll tell you what, she and Tommy Stewart," she meaning Priscilla, "she and Tommy Stewart would leave after school and God knows where they went. She would wait for Tommy after soccer practice and he wouldn't even get cleaned up. He'd go with her to get cleaned up." The relationship, according to several classmates, had begun even before Elvis returned to the States, possibly before she met Elvis. But the author doesn't definitively say whether or not that was indeed the case. And a lot of these classmates that the author is talking to, they're saying that Priscilla was not a strong student, that she had absolutely zero interest in school. But think about it. I mean, at this point, you are 14 going on 24 yourself, running around with Elvis, apparently, according to this author and the people that she's interviewing, running around with bad boys at school, all this kind of stuff. So, of course, academics aren't going to really hold a strong place in Priscilla's life. And she's talking to a kid by the name of Dave Grant, the author, and that's someone that she apparently got all the answers to all of her German exams from. And another classmate, Bob Thomas, said that she used a classmate by the name of George Bennett to do all of her homework. And Bob says he was awestruck, this kid George. And how can I say this kindly, Bob said. She didn't even know how to open a book, meaning a school book. And apparently, Jacqueline Momberg, who was the dean of girls at Priscilla's high school, said that her grades were below average, and that whether that was her innate ability or lack of interest, I have no idea. That's kind of crazy to have a dean of girls. In one of the other chapters, the author's talking to her principal from elementary school or something back in Texas, and now she's talking to the dean of girls from her high school. It's just crazy to me what a little investigator this author is. But you have to remember that at this time in her life, Priscilla is telling us the exact opposite story in her version of events, her memoir. She's telling us that the only thing on her mind was Elvis. I mean, Priscilla doesn't try to portray herself as being any type of academic by any stretch. She indeed does tell us that school just was really of no concern to her, especially when she met Elvis. That Elvis was her focus. And like I told you before, she characterizes it as she ate, slept, and breathed Elvis, became a real concern to her parents, who were watching her get depressed and withdrawn and wondering what are they going to do with this girl. And that's what she's relaying in all the stories of her life around this time. But there's absolutely no mention in Elvis and Me or in Softly as I Leave You of any other boys after Elvis. Absolutely none. She does reference slightly in Elvis and Me something to the effect, because I just read it a few months back. She's referencing that, you know, she went through the motions for her parents, and she would kind of force herself to be in social situations or possibly go on the odd date with a boy here and there, kind of prove to her parents that she wasn't being incorrigible, that she actually was making an effort to kind of move on after Elvis left. But absolutely no mention of any other boys at all going forward after Elvis. And in the next chapter, the author's going to start showing us and telling us about more and more and more boys that were in Priscilla's life after Elvis, which is something that we never heard from her in any of her accounts. So at this point of the book, it's now Christmas time. Elvis is going to be leaving Germany in about 2 months at that point. Elvis gifts Priscilla a beautiful platinum diamond watch, which, according to the author, she is only so happy to show off to people at school, including the school secretary and a student by the name of Steffi McCann, who, if you've been with me in previous episodes, was one of the young girls that Priscilla was pestering to get an invite to go meet Elvis, because she knew that Steffi knew people who knew Elvis. But also, more importantly, at this time, CURRIE Grant and his wife Carol are still very much involved in Elvis's life, and they were turning up at Christmas parties at Elvis's house and apparently had spent New Year's Eve. CURRIE and his wife Carol had spent New Year's Eve with Paul and Anne Beaulieu and another couple friend of Elvis's, a man by the name of Cliff Gleaves and his fiancée Gerda. So that's important to point out again, because in previous episodes we talked about how Priscilla had alleged that CURRIE had tried to attack her on 2 or even 3 separate occasions, although she seems murky on how many times it happens. She alleged twice, but then at another time she alleged 3 times. And then at that point, the author was like, well, what is it, 2 or 3? An attempted R would probably be something that you would remember. You would know if it was 2 times attempted or 3. So Priscilla, before even this chapter, was telling the author, telling everybody, telling us in her memoirs that she had told Elvis about CURRIE and his questionable behavior and attacks towards her. And because of that, Elvis had effectively banned CURRIE from his friend group, that he was nowhere around. Well, as we're progressing into Elvis and Priscilla's time together in Germany, we're finding that that actually wasn't the case, that CURRIE and his wife Carol were not banned from the group. And moreover, Priscilla says that she told her parents that CURRIE tried to attack her on 2, if not 3 different occasions. And, you know, her parents were enraged and banished her from having anything to do with CURRIE, that he was no longer able to pick her up, or she wasn't allowed to go anywhere with him. But then we find out that she went to a movie with CURRIE after she supposedly told her parents that he tried to attack her. Like, all this stuff, none of this is adding up. None of this is adding up. If he is indeed a suspected attacker who tried to R her, why is he still hanging around in the friend group? And then why is he spending New Year's Eve at a hotel in Frankfurt with Anne and Paul Beaulieu? Wouldn't they have wanted nothing to do with a man that supposedly tried to attack their 14-year-old daughter? And moreover, Paul was CURRIE's military superior. Wouldn't he have reported CURRIE to his superiors? None of this makes sense, you guys. The author even goes into a little sidebar story about how Paul Beaulieu, at that New Year's Eve party in Frankfurt, got tipsy and started hitting on Cliff Gleaves, one of Elvis's friends. Cliff's fiancée Gerda, like, hit on her, put his hand on her knee or something, and it caused this huge row between Cliff and Gerda. And I guess Paul Beaulieu eventually ended up apologizing later in the evening. But I was like, okay, here's yet another story to substantiate the fact that Paul Beaulieu is a man that really enjoyed his drink and that his behavior was affected by his drinking. Priscilla's telling the author, she's telling us in her memoirs, that she told Elvis that CURRIE was a snake who tried to attack her. Elvis flips out, bans CURRIE, but now here we are going into Christmas. CURRIE and his wife are still around. New Year's, CURRIE and his wife are still around, hanging with Elvis's friends in Elvis's friend group. Also hanging out with Priscilla's parents, who, you know, apparently she told that he attacked her. All of that. Author says CURRIE was also on the scene for Elvis's birthday party held on their mutual birthday, January 8th. CURRIE, Grant, and Elvis shared the same birthday, January 8th, although CURRIE was 3 years older than Elvis. So at the time when he was allegedly dallying with Priscilla, she was 14, CURRIE was 27. Lovely. So it says that CURRIE was the one who took the first photograph of Elvis and Priscilla that evening, the now famous shot of Elvis feeding Priscilla birthday cake. By that time, she was spending 3 and 4 nights a week with Elvis by then, but was still consumed by fear, meaning, that insecurity and that fear of what type of place would she have in Elvis's life once he left Germany. Now we're moving into even more events that question the validity of all of Priscilla's stories and claims. We're getting to he's leaving. Elvis is leaving Germany. It is now Monday, March 1st, 1960. The public got the first mention of Pricilla Beaulieu at all. And this is by name. And ironically, it's by Elvis himself. It says the public at large got its first inkling of Pricilla Beaulieu at 9 a.m. German time on Monday, March 1st, 1960, from an unexpected source, Elvis himself. The occasion was a farewell press conference the day before his departure, attended by 70 newsmen who had congregated in Freiburg to hear the singer-soldier wax eloquent on army life. They received an unexpected bonus when Elvis, clearly besotted, revealed that he had been seeing a young American girl named Pricilla Beaulieu, the daughter of an Air Force captain. Priscilla came by her later gilding of the truth naturally, for Elvis altered the facts that morning. Priscilla, he volunteered, was 16, and their meetings took place, he said, in her father's home. So here we have Elvis bending the truth a little bit, telling the press corps that Priscilla was 16, not 14, no doubt trying to, maintain respectability and protect his image and not wanting to get into any hairy situations. And it says that afternoon, the Beaulieu family's phone was just ringing off the hook, and Paul Beaulieu was kind of in a frantic state, doing everything he could to field off all these questions from all these reporters and things, trying to insist that, the relationship's nothing serious. They're just friends. Everything is on the up and up. And it says his only concern, he said later, was that he not embarrass Elvis. And it's in this time when Elvis gives that press conference, he lets the cat out of the bag. Pricilla Beaulieu drops a name. We have a name. All these reporters are calling the Beaulieu residence. Paul's try to field all this. And that's when we get all of those famous photographs of Priscilla in her home. She's holding an Elvis record, posing by the record player. It shows her sitting at a table, with a framed photo of Elvis in his GI uniform, and she's kind of like penning a letter. That's where we get all those photos, because the journalists went to the Beaulieu home and were photographing Priscilla. So now this is literally the day before Elvis leaves when we see Priscilla posing for all these photos, the day before he leaves Germany. It says Priscilla was riding a rocket, holding on for dear life. She spent Elvis's last night in Germany in his bedroom, where they had spent most of their evenings together. It was, by her description, a desperate, passionate night. A confused teenager saying goodbye to her boyfriend, pleading with him for intercourse. As they lay in bed, she later wrote in her memoir, he told her for the first time that he loved her. CURRIE and Carol Grant were at the house that evening for a big farewell, and Elvis asked them to bring Priscilla to Bad Nauheim the next morning to say goodbye. This was another point of contention between CURRIE and Priscilla when they met in spring of 1996. Now remember, according to Priscilla and her accounts, CURRIE would have been banned from Elvis and his friend group at that time because she had said, hey, Elvis, this dude tried to attack me. He would have been gone, right? So now the author is saying that's still a huge point of contention. One of them, when we're not talking about alleged R's or him saying that they consummated a relationship and it was mutual because that's what she and he understood needed to happen before CURRIE would take her to go meet Elvis for the first time. So they're going on back and forth. And the author asks CURRIE, she says, CURRIE, don't you say that you and Carol drove Priscilla from her home to Elvis's home the day he left? And he says, yes, at Elvis's request. And Priscilla's like, nope, didn't happen. And CURRIE's saying, boy, she's revising the whole history book. Carol and I picked her up at the house because Elvis asked me to the night before to bring her out to say goodbye. So CURRIE says he's picking Priscilla up from her house, taking her from her house to Elvis's house in Bad Nauheim so that the four of them can accompany Elvis to the bus that he needs to take to the airport to fly back home. And Priscilla's like, wait, excuse me, what is your recollection of this? And CURRIE's like, there's no recollection. It's exactly what happened. I just told you. We picked you up at your house. And Priscilla says, and you think my father would let you pick me up? And CURRIE says, oh, he was glad to let me pick you up that day, meaning Paul Beaulieu. He was so glad to let me pick you up that day. And Priscilla's like, I'm sorry, you have got to talk to my father. And then CURRIE says, we just went up there, picked you up, took you up, spent a half hour at Elvis's house. Then we all got in my car. A life cameraman took all the pictures around my car. I'm standing outside holding the door, the car door, in fact, for Elvis and her to get in so that he could say goodbye to his friends. Priscilla, you don't remember that, huh? And then he's like basically telling her like, you've been in LA way too long, Priscilla, if you're going to rewrite history like this. And then the author says that after that heated exchange, and I told you before in different episodes that when she had that exchange with CURRIE, Priscilla was so pissed and so upset and so enraged that she fled the author's home and got into a collision on the way back to her house. And the author says that that very night, Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's best friends, calls the author to refute everything that CURRIE was saying in that meeting at her house between him and Priscilla. You know, the author's saying, like, did she enlist Joe's help to just call and substantiate her story? Probably. So Joe was basically saying that, you know, there was no way that CURRIE drove Elvis and her to the airport on the last day, that didn't happen. But it gets better, you guys. This conflict could be independently corroborated. An obscure German magazine in the early 1960s published a photo account of Elvis's last day in Germany. One of the photos showed CURRIE Grant opening the door of his 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air, just as he described for Pricilla Beaulieu and Elvis Presley to go to the base. CURRIE's veracity on this point did not prove conclusively that Priscilla was lying or in denial about all of their points of disagreement, but it went a long way toward establishing his legitimacy and her desperation. What do you guys think of that? I have seen those photos. I don't know how many of them I'm going to pepper into the video. Like I said, I've gotten into things before with putting photos. That's why I had to take my entire Errol Flynn series down. Really still broke up and in agony over that one, in case you haven't noticed. But you've got photographic evidence of CURRIE there on Elvis's last day in Germany. The man who was supposedly banned from the friend group because he had tried to attack Priscilla. Riddle me this, Priscilla. How can you carry on like this? How can she? You know, the author has said that she feels that in her interviews with a psychologist by the name of John Bradshaw that we've quoted in earlier episodes, that John Bradshaw, the psychologist, is basically saying, you know, sometimes people get so wrapped up in their narratives, in their lies, in their delusions. It's not even so much that they're denying the truth. It's they're denying what they believe to be false. Like, she really believes in her mind that none of this played out the way that CURRIE, the way that all these people that Suzanne Finstad is interviewing say that it happened. So just really sad. And then the author puts this little sidebar in here where apparently it seems like the author took the taped interviews between CURRIE and Priscilla and presented them to this guy named Ray Gunther, who was a scientist and expert witness with 10 years experience evaluating truthfulness by measuring the stress level of a person's voice via a special computer called a Personality Stress Evaluator, or a PSE. And the author goes on to say that she presented that taped interview to Ray and said, what do you make of this? Of all the points of contention between them, how CURRIE says that she approached him wanting entree into Elvis's world. CURRIE said that they were intimate and it was mutual, and it was kind of like an unspoken arrangement between them so that CURRIE then would take her to meet Elvis. Like, what about that? What about the fact that CURRIE says that he didn't attack her? So the author is basically presenting, like, this is everything that CURRIE is asserting. This is everything Priscilla is asserting. What do you make of this, you know, in light of this voice stress test evaluation? And it's crazy. It says that Of 28 points in dispute between CURRIE and Priscilla, Gunther, the evaluator, found CURRIE to be telling the truth 100% of the time. He determined that Priscilla was deceptive in all but one of her statements, that she believed CURRIE introduced himself jokingly to her as Johnny Appleseed. CURRIE, however, was deemed truthful in saying he did not remember using the name Johnny Appleseed. So in essence, that debunks the one thing that she supposedly said that, she thought was true. But yeah, like everything about just from how she always says, well, I didn't know that CURRIE knew Elvis. Why would I go up to a stranger? And CURRIE's like, well, of course she knew I knew Elvis. And these classmates that the author's interviewing say, yeah, she knew that CURRIE knew Elvis. That's why she was pestering us and CURRIE for an invite to go to Elvis's house. So just all of these things, you guys. I mean, how embarrassing this book must have been at the time that it was published. But again, I will reiterate, just like I have in so many other episodes in this series, this author was not sued by Priscilla Presley. Priscilla Presley did not sue the publisher either. And she went after CURRIE Grant. I'll link that video. You can go check that one out. She went after him, but actually the confidential legal agreement that they both entered into after the defamation lawsuit was settled, even though Priscilla technically won that defamation lawsuit, she didn't get any money from him. And both of them were essentially muzzled and gagged from talking about one another in the press ever from that point on. So not exactly a stellar, striking victory for Priscilla there. But I don't know about this whole voice stress test stuff. I looked it up because the author's asserting that this voice stress test is apparently more accurate than polygraph tests. And the author was saying that at that time, the book was written in 1997, that this stress test was employed in over 900 police stations around the country. But in my research, I found that yes, that computer voice stress test is still used today in today's day and age, but that it's not considered the more accurate tool, that the polygraph is still and remains the more dominant tool that police and detectives use in their investigations, and that it's considered the polygraph more accurate by the broader scientific community. That basically the voice stress test is highly controversial. There's been a lot of independent studies. There was one by the National Institute of Justice found that these voice stress tests are accurate to about 50%, which is basically the equivalent of a coin toss. And these voice stress tests and these polygraphs, they can't really be used as evidence in a court of law. They're basically used as interrogation techniques by law enforcement, but very, very interesting. So, the author is hell-bent on telling us that these tests are highly accurate and, that this tester here, he would basically bet his life on the fact that Priscilla was 100% lying and CURRIE was 100% accurate and truthful in his accounts. But I'm saying voice stress test or no stress test. I mean, I think everything we've learned up to this point, everything that we know about Priscilla and her changing narrative and all the stuff that all these people say in her life that knew her at the time, do we really need a voice stress test to tell us that Priscilla is being deceptive and she's not being forthcoming with information and sequence of events and what happened? I mean, hello. So it's the last morning in Germany. CURRIE Grant is in the car with Carol, his wife. Elvis and Priscilla are in the backseat. And it says, Carol Grant remembered that last morning clearly. They, Elvis and Priscilla, sat in the back and I sat in the front with CURRIE. She was wearing a scarf. Elvis, I remember, had put all this tan bastic all over himself so that he looked like he had a tan. Sounds to me like maybe some kind of bronzing makeup or something. I've never heard of that brand. It's probably defunct. It's from the 50s or whatever. Priscilla never mentioned to either CURRIE nor Carol that she had spoken to reporters the afternoon before. Remember I told you that little interview and photographic sesh that Priscilla had at her home? So that had happened the day before, remember? So Carol saying and CURRIE saying that Priscilla didn't mention that at all to them. She didn't mention that she'd spoken to reporters the afternoon before, nor did she tell her principal why she wanted to be excused from class that morning. She said merely that she was seeing a friend off at the airport. She was ever the secret keeper, a sphinx, her mother's daughter. Alone in the car with CURRIE and Carol that morning on the way to Elvis's, although she prattled on like the teenager she was until they drove up to Elvis's house. When the demure Priscilla stepped out of the car, it was amazing. CURRIE marveled later to watch the transformation. And we talked about that before. She would always be a chatterbox in the car with CURRIE or Carol on the way to go meet Elvis. And she was like that the night she met him, prattling on, chewing bubblegum acting like a 14-year-old. But as soon as it got to the car, as soon as it got time to go see Elvis, it was like she completely changed. The transformation began. She became kind of like this ice princess, demure Gibson girl personality. So they're en route to the base. Elvis gives Priscilla his army jacket, much like a high schooler would give his high school girlfriend his Letterman jacket. And he said to her, I'm giving you this because you belong to me, and I want you to promise me that you'll stay the way that you are, untouched, just as I left you. And Priscilla told the author that she felt a chill at Elvis's parting words, because he had told her, stay innocent just this way, because if something happens and you change, I'll know. And it just completely freaked her out, scared the daylights out of her. And it said that he kissed her, got out of the car to board a bus that would take him to the plane, and she then headed to the airport with Currie and Carol, just completely frozen, just numb. And she's telling Suzanne, the author, that she just felt numb and confused by all of her conflicting feelings. Here he's in this relationship with this adult celebrity, and she's like, holy hell, am I ever going to see him again? What's to become of me in his life? What's to become of our relationship? So they get to the airport to see Elvis off, and it's Carol and it's Currie and it's Priscilla. And Priscilla is at this point in a little crowd that is watching and waiting for Elvis to board the plane. And then Cliff Gleaves shows up. Now, Cliff is the guy who was at that Frankfurt hotel with Anne and Paul Beaulieu for New Year's Eve a few months before. Remember the guy whose fiance allegedly got hit on by Paul, and it was a very upsetting situation. So Cliff Gleaves is also a very good friend of Elvis's, and he's there also seeing Elvis off. And the author says that he's talking to Currie, Cliff Gleaves. He walks up to Currie, and it was there that Currie first learned from Cliff Gleaves that Priscilla had tried to freeze him out of Bad Nauheim the previous November, meaning out of Elvis's friend group. And Cliff had waited to break this news until Elvis was en route home to avoid upsetting Currie. And this is Currie now talking to the author. Cliff told me that Priscilla told EP that I was asking too many questions, Currie recalled. EP just laughed about it. He wasn't going to ban Carol and me. And it was at that point that Currie just was so infuriated by what Cliff had told him. He said that him and Carol, his wife, were just completely flabbergasted. They felt betrayed. They were like, Priscilla's carrying on like everything's okay with us and we're all simpatico, but here she is trying to ice and freeze us out behind our backs to Elvis. So Cliff said that what he ended up doing was, he looks over, he sees Priscilla in this small-ish crowd waiting to see Elvis off. What he does is he raced over to the airstrip. He pulled aside the head of a press corps and he points out Priscilla in the crowd. They get whiff of who it is, and the press corps is like, jackpot. This is that Pricilla Beaulieu that Elvis was speaking about in that press junket interview that he gave just a couple of days before. It says Elvis may have revealed Priscilla's name 2 days earlier, but Currie had let the genie out of the bottle. Within seconds, paparazzi had formed around her and flashbulbs ignited. An enterprising photographer looking for a dramatic shot directed her to run toward the plane, and Priscilla, dazed and confused, complied. The classic photograph of Pricilla Beaulieu waving a wistful farewell to Elvis was staged, as were several of the other airport shots of her that day. So all very interesting, and I guess Currie was so enraged that he was like, okay, I am not going to play her little reindeer games anymore. And that's why he pointed her out to the paparazzi. Who knows what he thought? Maybe in the back of his mind, even without thinking, he was just so enraged. I mean, really, to point her out, it would have been even that much more easy now that you can put a face to a name. Her identity would have come out. It would have come out that her age possibly could have gotten Elvis in trouble. Maybe that's why Currie did it. So when you think of it that way, if Currie had wanted to stay around in Elvis's friend group, probably not the best thing to do. Who knows what was the motivation to call her out to the paparazzi, but he did it. And there's a friend that Priscilla had back in Austin, Texas, who was named Carol Ann Hyde, and she was one of the closest people to Priscilla ever, like in the way of like a female relationship. And she said that she saw that picture of Priscilla waving goodbye to Elvis in the Austin American-Statesman newspaper, and she wasn't surprised. She said, quote, "I always felt her mother had a plan for her, so it was like her mother got her wish." And then the chapter ends with something that is so sad. It's so unbelievably sad, you guys. It says, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, someone else saw the photo of Priscilla, which was reprinted in Life that week. Catherine Wagner, flipping through the Elvis in Germany pictorial entitled Farewell to Priscilla, Hello to USA. And she stopped frozen when she saw Priscilla's picture. The last name was obviously wrong, Beaulieu, you know, because she's a Wagner, really, technically. But she knew that that was her granddaughter. You know, she had known that her daughter-in-law had remarried Paul Beaulieu, so of course she recognized that the Beaulieu last name, that was her granddaughter, her Priscilla. But can you imagine not seeing Priscilla for almost 14 years, not really knowing what had become of her, what had become of Anne once she married Paul Beaulieu, all of it, to look, and how soul crushing to see your granddaughter. I mean, you're probably experiencing so many different emotions, elation, but yet such deep, deep sadness at the same time. So that is the end of this chapter, you guys. I know that these are a little bit long, but they're quite juicy. So what do you think about everything that's going on? Do you think that Priscilla was as demure and innocent and in love with Elvis as she's told us for years in her memoirs? Or do you think that she was a little bit more cunning and calculated and just more advanced, so to speak, in her maturity and her experiences, and, you know, just not so much crazy in love with Elvis? I mean, wanting to be with him, but yet disillusioned with him and the reality of who the man really was behind the image. Do you think that she was running around behind his back, either when he was still in country or for sure after he left? We're going to get into all of that because the next chapter, chapter 15, is going to be called Two-Timing Elvis. I don't know how really fair that is to say two-timing Elvis, considering the fact that I don't think that Elvis was ever faithful to one woman in his entire life. He was just not made for monogamy. I mean, that's pretty well documented, but that's what the chapter is called, Two-Timing Elvis. But I guess it's apropos when you think about the fact that, you know, again, she's been trying to tell us for decades that Elvis was her one and only, that she saved herself for him, and that she never thought of anybody once he came into her life. This next chapter is going to serve to blow that little assertion out of the water as well. So I can't wait to see you guys on that one. Like the video, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. I'm a small creator, and just that like, that sub does so much to help me bring more videos to you guys. Thank you so much for all your time today, and I will talk to you very, very soon. Bye.